At 6:50 a.m. on September 7, 1998, Patricia Doyle pulled back a blanket that should have had two small bodies underneath it, and found nothing but a flattened pillow still warm from the night before. For one long second, she told herself she was looking at the wrong bed. Then she called her husband's name in a voice that didn't sound like her own, and the search that would consume the next 25 years of her family's life began before either of them had even finished waking up. 9 hours earlier, everything had still been ordinary. On the evening of September 6, 1998, the Doyle family settled into Cabin 14 at Pine Lake Resort in northern Michigan, expecting nothing more than one last weekend of summer before school started again. By morning, they would be living inside a mystery that would take 25 years to unravel. Two sisters, Emma Doyle, age 7, and Lily Doyle, age 5, vanished from a cabin less than 60 feet from their sleeping parents, and no one, not a single guest at the resort, could say they saw them leave. The door was found unlatched. The blankets showed no sign of struggle, and the family dog, sleeping in the same room, never made a sound. The Doyles were from Grand Rapids. Michael Doyle, 34, worked as an insurance adjuster, a steady, unremarkable job that let him take his family on a modest lake trip every Labor Day weekend. His wife, Patricia, 31, had grown up coming to Pine Lake herself as a child, and brought her own daughters there because she wanted them to have the same simple memory. Dock jumping, esmores, the smell of pine needles in the morning. Neither of them could have imagined that the last ordinary night of their lives was already underway before the sun went down. Emma was the planner. Even at 7, she organized games for the other kids at the resort, kept a small notebook of rules for whatever activity she'd invented that day. Lily followed her older sister everywhere, copying her laugh, her walk, her opinions. Guests who'd been coming to Pine Lake for years said the two girls were impossible not to notice. Always together, always narrating some story only they understood. The family had rented Cabin 14, one of 11 small cabins arranged in a loose semicircle around a central fire pit, all about 100 yards from the lake itself. On the last night, there'd been a bonfire. Nothing unusual, something the resort hosted most weekends. The girls stayed up later than normal, roasting marshmallows with two other families who were also checking out the next morning. Patricia remembered Emma teaching a younger boy how to get the perfect golden brown marshmallow without catching it on fire. She remembered Lily falling half asleep against her sister's shoulder by the fire's dying light. Around 9:40 p.m., Patricia walked the girls back to the cabin, tucked them into the pull-out bed in the front room, and returned to the fire for another 20 minutes to help the resort owner put it out properly. Michael checked on them once more around 10:15, saw both girls asleep, and went to bed himself in the back room shortly after 11. At 6:50 the next morning, Patricia woke to get the girls ready for the 4-hour drive home. The pull-out bed was empty. The blankets were pushed to one side, not thrown off in a hurry, not disturbed the way a struggle might leave them, just moved, the way a child moves a blanket when they get up on their own. The front door of the cabin, which locked only from the inside with a simple latch, was unlatched. For the first few minutes, neither parent panicked. Pine Lake was the kind of place where children wandered down to the dock, over to a friend's cabin, out to look at the lake in the morning fog. Michael checked the dock first. Empty. Patricia checked the cabins on either side, waking families who hadn't seen either girl. She checked the bathhouse. She checked the resort office, which didn't open until 8. By 7:20, both parents were moving between cabins at a near run, and by 7:35, the resort owner had called the county sheriff's department. What followed in the next several hours was a search that would define the rest of the Doyle family's lives. The initial theory, like so many lake disappearances, centered on the water. Pine Lake was calm that week, no strong current, but any parent's first fear when children go missing near water is the water itself. Divers were brought in from 2 counties over by early afternoon. They searched the shoreline near Cabin 14, then widened out along the swimming area, then out past the dock into deeper water. Nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle at the shoreline. Nothing to suggest either girl had gone near the lake at all that night. The second theory was that the girls had simply wandered off together, the way Emma sometimes led her sister on small adventures. Search teams combed the wooded property surrounding the resort, an area that stretched nearly 2 miles before hitting the county road. Dogs were brought in to track scent from the cabin's front step. The trail went cold less than 30 yards from the cabin door. Not because the dogs lost the scent through carelessness, but because, according to the handlers, the trail simply stopped, the way scent trails do when someone is picked up and carried, or placed inside a vehicle. That detail, the scent trail ending abruptly so close to the cabin, became the piece of the case that investigators kept returning to for the next 2 decades. By evening on September 7th, the sheriff's department treated the case as a likely abduction. Roadblocks went up on the 2 routes leading away from Pine Lake. Every vehicle that had checked out of the resort that morning was tracked down and its occupants questioned. Every guest still present was interviewed about what they'd seen or heard overnight. Almost everyone remembered the bonfire. Almost everyone remembered the girls. No one remembered anything unusual after the fire was put out. No strange cars, no strangers near the cabins. No sounds of a child crying or being carried. The lack of a witness became, just as it had for so many families before the Doyles, the emptiest and most frightening part of the case. 2 children had been taken from 60 feet away from their sleeping parents, at a resort with barely 30 guests, and not one person had seen or heard it happen. News of the disappearance reached statewide television by September 8th. Flyers with Emma and Lily's photographs went up across Michigan and into Wisconsin, Ohio, and Indiana. Tips poured in, a family spotted at a rest stop in Kalamazoo, 2 girls seen crying in a car outside a diner in Toledo, a man who'd asked too many questions about children at a gas station near the Indiana border. Investigators chased each one. None led anywhere. For Michael and Patricia, the first year became an exercise in learning to survive inside a question that never closed. Michael went back to work within 2 months, not because he'd healed, but because Patricia insisted someone needed to hold the family's finances together while she spent her days working with a growing network of missing children advocates, learning the language of age-progressed photographs and interstate case files that so many parents before her had been forced to learn. By 2001, the active search had slowed the way these cases always do, not from lack of care, but from lack of evidence. The files stayed open. Emma and Lily's photos stayed in national databases. But the daily machinery of searching gave way to something quieter and much harder to live inside. Waiting. The false leads came in waves over the following years, the way they always do. In 2004, a girl matching Lily's age-progressed photo was reported at a church shelter in Kentucky. She turned out to be a local child with no connection to the case. In 2007, a tip from a woman in Ohio claimed to have recognized Emma, now a young teenager, working at a family's roadside produce stand. Investigators found a girl who resembled the sketch but was, in fact, the stand owner's niece. Each lead cost the Doyles something they couldn't get back. A week of hope, followed by a week of grief they had to relearn from the beginning. Patricia became, over time, one of the most active parents in a growing online community of missing children families. Long before social media made this kind of advocacy common, she was mailing packets of information to shelters, pediatric offices, and school districts across 6 states. She learned to read tips with a kind of careful, guarded skepticism that never fully protected her from being hurt again. Michael carried the case differently. He returned over and over in his mind, to the 20 minutes he'd spent asleep before his final check on the girls, to the unlatched door, to the question of whether a stronger lock or a lighter sleep might have changed everything. He and Patricia never blamed each other out loud. The blame lived quietly underneath ordinary conversations instead, the way it does in so many households carrying a wound with no scar to show for it. By 2008, 10 years after the disappearance, the case was formally reclassified as cold. The lead detective, a woman named Carol Reyes who had worked the file since the beginning, told Patricia what detectives so often tell parents in this position: that a cold case is not a closed case, that new evidence or new technology could reopen it at any time. Patricia held onto that sentence for the next 15 years. In 2015, Genetic Genealogy, DNA databases originally built for people tracing family trees, began solving decades-old criminal cases across the country, cases that had gone cold long before anyone imagined ancestry websites could crack them open. Reyes, who had stayed with the sheriff's department specifically to keep working cold cases like the Doyle girls, submitted both parents' DNA to a law enforcement accessible genealogy database in 2016, hoping that if either girl or her children someday ever took a consumer ancestry test, the connection might surface. For 7 years, nothing did. Then, in February of 2023, a 19-year-old woman named Casey Torres, living in Bloomington, Indiana, submitted a DNA sample to a popular consumer ancestry service as a birthday gift from her boyfriend, mostly out of curiosity about the ethnic breakdown that came with the results. She had grown up believing she was the biological daughter of Frank and Diane Torres, a couple who had raised her since she was small. Her parents had always told her she'd been adopted informally from a young mother who couldn't care for her, a story with just enough vagueness that Casey had never questioned it as a child. The ancestry results flagged an unusually strong match to a profile already logged in a law enforcement genealogy database, a rare cross-reference that triggered an automatic notification to the detective who'd originally submitted it. Carol Reyes, 7 years into retirement by then but still consulting part-time on the case out of what she later called stubbornness, got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. The match pointed to a sibling-level relationship with the DNA profile on file for Emma Doyle. Reyes moved carefully. She had seen cases like this collapse under the weight of hope before. She contacted Indiana authorities first, then reached out to Casey directly through the Ancestry Service's law enforcement liaison process, rather than approaching her cold. Casey, confused and a little frightened, agreed to a phone call. What Casey didn't know, what she'd never had reason to question, was that Frank and Diane Torres had taken her in during the fall of 1998, when she was 5 years old, through an arrangement made by a woman they'd known only as a family friend of a friend, someone who told them the girl's young mother had died and there was no other family willing to take her. They'd never filed formal adoption paperwork through the state, believing at the time that the arrangement was simply informal guardianship of a relative's child, the kind of quiet, undocumented family arrangement that wasn't uncommon in the area. They had loved her as their own for 25 years and never once suspected anything else. Casey's age matched Lily Doyle. Her arrival into the Torres family lined up, almost to the month, with the disappearance from Pine Lake. When Reyes explained the situation to Patricia and Michael, both parents reacted with the specific, guarded hope of people who had been disappointed too many times to trust it fully. They flew to Indiana in March 2023. A DNA test, run through proper legal channels this time, confirmed within 2 weeks what the ancestry match had already suggested. Casey Torres was Lily Doyle. The reunion was not simple. Casey had grown up loved, stable, and entirely unaware that her life had begun with a crime. Frank and Diane Torres, devastated to learn the truth, cooperated fully with investigators and were never charged. Evidence showed clearly they had believed the story they'd been told. Casey herself needed months to even begin using the name Lily, and by mutual, careful agreement with Patricia and Michael, she never fully stopped being Casey either. She kept both. But Emma was still missing, and the discovery of Lily's path, quietly placed with a trusting family through a woman who'd since vanished from any traceable record, gave investigators their first real thread pointing toward what had actually happened at Pine Lake in 1998. The woman Frank and Diane remembered only vaguely, a friend of a friend named Donna, had arranged at least one other informal placement in the same period, according to a name that surfaced in an old church adoption support group's records from 1999. That placement led investigators to a family in southern Illinois who, in 1998, had taken in a young girl through a similarly vague arrangement. A girl they'd raised as their own daughter, now 25 years old, who had never questioned her background because she'd never had a reason to. Her name was Grace Whitfield. Her DNA, submitted quietly and voluntarily once investigators reached her in the summer of 2023, confirmed what the timeline had already suggested. Grace Whitfield was Emma Doyle. The woman behind both placements, eventually identified through old phone records and a handful of surviving handwritten letters kept by the Illinois family, was a former hospital social worker named Donna Rice, who had spent much of the late 1990s quietly connecting infertile or eager adoptive families with children she claimed came from unstable or absent birth parents, bypassing legal channels for a fee, and in at least the Doyle girls' case, taking children who had never been surrendered by anyone at all. Rice had died in 2011, taking most of the specific details of that September night at Pine Lake with her. What investigators could piece together, largely through the handwritten letters and a partial confession she'd apparently made to a relative years earlier, was that Rice had been staying at a cabin near the resort that weekend, had noticed the two unattended, sleeping girls during the same late walk that put out the bonfire, and had simply taken them, quickly, through the unlatched door, placing them within days into two separate homes that were, by any ordinary measure, loving ones. There was no trafficking ring, no network of buyers, no cruelty in the way the girls had been raised. There was only a woman who had decided, alone, that two children belonged somewhere other than where they'd been sleeping, and two families who had never known enough to ask the right questions. That answer did not make the 25 years easier to hold. It made them, in some ways, harder because there was no single villain to blame for the whole shape of the loss, only a decision made in a few careless minutes by someone long dead, and a quarter-century of ordinary life that had grown up around it in two different households that had never done anything wrong. In September 2023, 25 years after the disappearance, the Doyle family stood together at Pine Lake for the first time since that Labor Day weekend. Michael, Patricia, Lily, who still answered just as easily to Casey, and Emma, who was still learning slowly what it meant to also be Grace. There were no cameras that day, no reporters, nothing but for people trying to understand what a family looks like when it has to be rebuilt instead of simply resumed. Healing, for the Doyles, did not mean returning to who they'd been before that September morning. It meant learning that love could survive a quarter-century of silence, not by pretending the silence hadn't happened, but by making room for everything that had grown inside it. Thank you for spending this time with the Doyle family's story. If it moved you, please consider sharing it, and take a moment today to check in on someone who might be carrying a silence of their own. Thanks for watching. Share and subscribe so that you won't miss out new stories that we upload. In September 2023, 25 years after the disappearance, the Doyle family stood together at Pine Lake for the first time since that Labor Day weekend. Michael, Patricia, Lily, who still answered just as easily to Casey, and Emma, who was still learning slowly what it meant to also be Grace. There were no cameras that day, no reporters, nothing but for people trying to understand what a family looks like when it has to be rebuilt instead of simply resumed. Healing, for the Doyles, did not mean returning to who they'd been before that September morning. It meant learning that love could survive a quarter-century of silence, not by pretending the silence hadn't happened, but by making room for everything that had grown inside it. Thank you for spending this time with the Doyle family's story. If it moved you, please consider sharing it, and take a moment today to check in on someone who might be carrying a silence of their own. Thanks for watching. Share and subscribe so that you won't miss out new stories that we upload.